The rescue of New Bizon was complete, but Captain Yoon Jae-sung knew that the real war was just beginning. The human fleet had saved 800 colonists, but they had also awakened something that the galaxy had never seen before: the wrath of an entire species. New orders came from Earth Command through quantum communication systems that could cross the galaxy in seconds. The message was simple and terrifying: the Vorth Empire must pay for what they had done to New Bizon. Every military installation within 50 light-years of the colony was marked for destruction. The orbital destroyers that had been built as defensive weapons now became instruments of justice. The fleet split into task forces and began a systematic campaign of retaliation. Each group carried enough firepower to destroy entire star systems, and they had permission to use it. Admiral Vexstar had escaped the battle at New Bizon, but his survival had become a curse. The human fleet pursued him across the galaxy, destroying his bases, sinking his ships, and making it clear that there would be no safe harbor for those who had participated in the colony's torment. The Vorth commander had thought he understood warfare, but this was something new. The humans were not just fighting for territory or resources, they were fighting for the principle that their people should never have to face extinction alone. It was a holy war, and they intended to win it. The first target was the Vorth naval base at Kepler 186. The installation had been built to support the invasion of human space, but now it faced the full fury of human technology. The orbital platform Sol's Hammer approached the system alone, carrying enough weapons to crack the planet's crust. The base commander sent desperate messages offering surrender, but the humans were not interested in prisoners. They had seen the recordings from New Bizon, the torture chambers, the execution pits, the systematic destruction of everything the colonists had built. The attack lasted 6 minutes. The naval base that had taken decades to build was reduced to expanding clouds of superheated gas. The Vorth ships stationed there never had a chance to fight back. Their shields collapsed under the first salvo, and their hulls vaporized under the second. Commander Han Soo-min watched the destruction from her command station and felt no satisfaction, only cold determination. The Vorth had shown no mercy to the colonists, and they would receive none in return. This was not about revenge, it was about justice. The human fleet moved from system to system like a plague of destruction. Every Vorth military installation was marked for elimination, and the orbital destroyers had the power to make those marks reality. The campaign lasted 6 months and changed the balance of power in the galaxy. The Vorth Empire, which had seemed unstoppable for centuries, suddenly found itself on the defensive. Their fleets were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced, and their colonies were defenseless against weapons that could strike from light years away. Other species in the galaxy took notice of the human campaign. The weak colonists, who had been ignored for decades, had revealed themselves as the most dangerous military force anyone had ever seen. Trade agreements and alliance offers began flooding Earth's diplomatic channels. The hunt for Admiral Vexstar became personal for Captain Yoon Jae-sung. The Vorth commander had been responsible for the suffering of New Bizon, and the orbital destroyer captain intended to make him pay. The chase led across dozens of star systems as the alien fled from system to system. Each time the admiral thought he had found safety, the human fleet would appear like an angel of death. The bases he used for resupply became craters. The ships he commanded were torn apart by weapons that seemed to violate the laws of physics. The Vorth military began to collapse under the pressure of the human assault. Their soldiers had been trained to fight other aliens, but they had never faced an enemy that could build weapons capable of destroying entire fleets in minutes. Commander Han Soo-min led the attack on the fortress world of Nexus Prime. The planet was the heart of Vorth military power, protected by orbital platforms and defended by their most elite troops. But human technology had advanced far beyond what the galaxy understood. The battle was fierce, but the outcome was never in doubt. The Vorth had numbers and determination, but the humans had weapons that could punch through the core of a planet. The fortress world that had stood for 1,000 years fell in a single day. The systematic destruction of Vorth military power sent a message to every species in the galaxy: humanity would travel any distance, pay any price, and face any enemy to protect its own. The attack on New Bizon had awakened something that the galaxy had never seen before. The human fleet did not just destroy military targets, they eliminated every trace of Vorth presence in human space supply depots, became craters, communication relays were vaporized. Repair facilities were reduced to molecular dust. The campaign reached its climax when the human fleet finally cornered Admiral Vextar and the Tau Ceti system. The Vorth commander had gathered the remnants of his forces for a final stand, but he was facing an enemy that had already proven its superiority. The battle lasted 3 hours, and when it was over, the Vorth Empire had lost its most experienced commander along with the last of their frontier fleets. The human victory was so complete that it entered galactic history as an example of what happened when humanity was truly aroused. Captain Yoon Jae-sung stood over the wreckage of the Admiral's flagship and felt a sense of closure. The man who had ordered the bombing of New Bizan was dead along with everyone who had followed his orders. The colonists had been avenged. The human fleet had proven that Earth's children were not alone in the galaxy. No matter how far they traveled or how dangerous their situation became, they could count on their homeworld to come for them. The bonds between human settlements were stronger than space itself. The campaign had cost the Vorth Empire everything. They had attacked one small colony and awakened the wrath of an entire species. Their fleets were destroyed, their bases were ruins, and their territory was open to conquest by their enemies. But the humans were not interested in empire building. They had come to deliver a message, and that message had been received. Every species in the galaxy now understood that humanity was not the weak prey they had appeared to. Beatty orbital destroyers began their journey back to Earth, carrying the news of total victory. The Vorth threat to human space had been eliminated, and the galaxy had learned to respect the power of a species that never abandoned its own. The survivors of New Bizan had given up hope, but their rescue had sparked something that would echo through the ages. Humanity had announced its presence to the galaxy, and that announcement had been written in fire across the stars. The message was clear and simple: touch one human and face them all. The galaxy would never forget the lesson of New Bizan, and humanity would never again be underestimated. The weak colonists had revealed themselves as the children of the most dangerous species in known space. The war was over, but the legend was just beginning. General Kethmo crouched in his command bunker and realized that everything had changed. The ground shook beneath his feet as another precision strike from orbit turned one of his tank formations into molten metal. The human ships above were not just attacking, they were hunting. The Vorth ground commander had never experienced defeat before. In 40 years of conquest, he had broken the spirits of dozens of species and claimed their worlds for the Empire. But these humans were different. They did not break, they did not surrender, they just became more dangerous. His communication officer reported that contact with the fleet had been lost. Every Vorth ship in orbit was either destroyed or fleeing toward deep space. The ground forces were trapped on an alien world with no hope of evacuation. The tables had turned, and now the Vorth were the ones facing extinction. The human orbital platforms were not content with simply driving off the invasion fleet. They had come for justice, and justice demanded payment in blood. Every Vorth position on the planet was being systematically destroyed by weapons that struck with the precision of a surgeon's blade. But the humans were not finished with orbital bombardment. They wanted to look their enemies in the eye. When they killed them, drop pods began falling from the sky like meteors, each one carrying soldiers who had trained their entire lives for this moment. The real war was about to begin. Sergeant Major Bae Sung-ho hit the ground, running his powered armor, absorbing the impact of his landing. The drop pod had delivered him directly into the heart of enemy territory. But he felt no fear. He had volunteered for this mission the moment he heard about the colony's fate. His squad was composed of veterans from Earth's most elite military units. They had trained together for months, studying Vorth tactics and learning their weaknesses. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the Earth Defense Force's finest warriors, chosen for their skill and their dedication to protecting human life. The Vorth had expected to face desperate civilians armed with mining equipment. Instead, they found themselves fighting professional soldiers equipped with the most advanced weapons Earth could produce. Human battle armor was lighter and stronger than anything the aliens had ever seen. Private Chen Wei-ming moved through the enemy positions like a ghost in the night. His stealth systems made him invisible to Vorth sensors, while his Weapons could punch through their heaviest armor. The aliens had never faced an enemy that could strike from the shadows with such deadly precision. The human soldiers carried more than just weapons, they carried the photos of every colonist who had died during the occupation. They had memorized the names of the children who had been killed in the bombing. They fought not just for victory, but for vengeance. The Vorth discovered that humans were different from other species they had conquered. Most aliens would surrender when faced with overwhelming force, but humans seemed to become more dangerous when their families were threatened. Each soldier fought with the fury of someone who had seen too much suffering. Lieutenant Park Jinwoo led his squad through the ruins of what had been a Vorth supply depot. The alien soldiers inside had been trained to fight other aliens, but they had never faced humans in combat. The difference was immediately apparent. Human tactics were unpredictable and adaptive, where other species followed rigid battle plans. The Earth Defense Force had studied every known form of warfare and developed new techniques specifically for fighting aliens. They moved like water, flowing around obstacles and striking where enemies were weakest. The Vorth had built their empire on fear and intimidation, but humans seemed immune to both. Fear of death meant nothing to soldiers who had volunteered for a suicide mission. Intimidation was useless against warriors who had seen the burned bodies of children in the colony's ruins. General Kethmal watched through his periscope as his forces were systematically destroyed. The human soldiers moved with a precision that spoke of years of training and a fury that spoke of absolute dedication. Every Vorth position was being overrun by enemies who seemed to anticipate their every move. The alien commander had studied human military history and thought he understood their capabilities, but the humans on the battlefield were nothing like the primitive warriors from their past. These were apex predators equipped with technology that made them nearly invincible. Captain Yoon Jae-sung monitored the ground battle from the Bridge of Soul's Hammer. The orbital destroyers' sensors tracked every human soldier and provided real-time intelligence about enemy movements. The ground forces were not fighting alone. They had the support of the most advanced war machines ever built. The battle was not just about saving one colony, it was about sending a message to every species in the galaxy. Humanity had hidden its true nature for decades, allowing others to see them as weak colonists and peaceful traders, but that mask had been torn away. Dr. Yuhana emerged from the medical bunker for the first time in months to see human soldiers securing the colony perimeter. Their armor was scarred from battle, but their movements were confident and professional. They had come to save her people, and they had succeeded. The Vorth who had terrorized the colonists for months were either dead or fleeing into the wilderness. Those who tried to surrender discovered that humans were not feeling merciful. The soldiers had seen too much suffering to show mercy to those who had caused it. Young technician Nam Ji-woo watched the tactical displays in amazement. The human forces were achieving victory after victory with minimal casualties. Their superior training and equipment were proving decisive, but more importantly, they were fighting for something they believed in. The battle lasted 18 hours, and when it was over, the Vorth presence on New Bizon had been completely eliminated. The alien soldiers who had seemed so terrifying just days before were revealed to be ordinary troops who had never faced a truly dangerous enemy. Sergeant Major Bae Sung-ho stood in the ruins of the enemy command post and looked down at the body of General Kethmal. The Vorth commander had died fighting, but his death had accomplished nothing. The human soldiers had achieved total victory. The colonists began emerging from their bunkers to find their world transformed. The Vorth fortifications were smoking ruins, and human soldiers were establishing security perimeters. The nightmare was over, but the galaxy had learned that humanity was not to be trifled with. Park Hyun-woo met with Captain Yoon Jae-sung in what remained of the colony's main square. The orbital destroyer captain's presence was commanding, but his eyes showed genuine concern for the suffering the colonists had endured. He explained that Earth had never forgotten them. The human response had been massive and coordinated. Every human world had contributed to the rescue effort, driven by the simple belief that no human should face extinction alone. The attack on New Bizon had awakened something that the galaxy had never seen before. The Vorth Empire had made a fatal error. They had assumed that because human colonies were lightly defended, the species as a whole was weak. but they had discovered that every human settlement was connected to Earth by bonds that could not be broken by. Dawn the planet was secure and the colonists were free, but the real war was just beginning. The human fleet had come not just to rescue 800 people, but to teach the galaxy a lesson about the consequences of attacking humanity's children. The message was written in the smoking ruins of the Vorth invasion force: touch one human and face them all. Private First Class Oda Yoon was the first human soldier to enter the colony bunkers. Her medical training had prepared her for treating combat wounds, but nothing could have prepared her for what she found: the colonists huddled in the darkness, like broken dolls, their eyes empty and staring. The young medic had volunteered for the rescue mission the moment she heard about New Bizan. Her own family had been colonists on another world, and she understood the fear that came with being far from home. She knelt beside the nearest group of survivors and spoke in a voice that was gentle but strong. "You are safe now," she told them. "We are here to take you home." The words seemed impossible to the colonists who had given up hope months ago. Many of them reached out to touch her armor as if to make sure she was real. Kim Sojin clutched her children and wept as she realized that the nightmare was finally over. The reunion scenes that followed were heartbreaking, and beautiful families that had been separated during the chaos of war found each other again. Parents who had thought their children were dead discovered them alive in other bunkers. Children who had been orphaned by the bombing were embraced by neighbors who had become family. Park Hyun-woo walked through the tunnels and marveled at the transformation. The spaces that had been filled with fear and despair just hours before were now bustling with activity, as human soldiers worked to provide medical care and comfort to the survivors. The rescue teams had come prepared for anything: medical supplies, food, water, and equipment for rebuilding everything the colonists needed to start their lives again. This was not just a military operation, it was a massive humanitarian effort involving resources from dozens of star systems. Captain Yoon Jae-sung met with the colony administrator in the ruins of the command center. The orbital destroyer captain had the bearing of a professional soldier, but his eyes showed genuine compassion for the suffering the colonists had endured. "Earth never forgot you," he explained. "The moment we lost contact with New Bizen, every human world began preparing for this rescue. The fleet you see above you represents the combined efforts of our entire species." The human response had been unprecedented in galactic history. When word reached Earth about the colony's fate, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Citizens demanded action, governments mobilized resources, and the military prepared for war. Dr. Lim Haijin had volunteered for the medical team. Despite having a comfortable practice on Earth, she had specialized in trauma treatment, but the psychological wounds she found on New Bizan were unlike anything in her experience. The colonists had endured months of terror, believing they were completely abandoned. The worst cases were the children who had watched their parents die in the bombing. Their young minds had been shattered by experiences no child should ever have to face. The medical team worked around the clock to provide not just physical healing but emotional support. Engineer teams from the rescue fleet began assessing the damage to the colony infrastructure. The Vorth had been systematic in their destruction, targeting anything that would make life difficult for the humans, but the rescue teams had brought everything needed to rebuild. The most moving moment came when Kim Sojin was reunited with her husband Lee Dong-min. He had been captured during the final defense of the colony and held in a Vorth prison camp for weeks. His captors had tortured him for information about the colony's defenses, but he had told them nothing. Their embrace in the makeshift medical station brought tears to the eyes of hardened soldiers who had seen too much war. The sight of a family reunited reminded everyone what they had fought to preserve. It was not just about territory or resources, it was about people. The human soldiers, who had seemed so fierce in battle, showed a different side as they worked with the colonists' children, who had been terrified of everything, began to smile as armored warriors played games with them. The same hands that had wielded weapons of war now offered comfort and hope. Captain Yoon Jae-sung explained to the colonists that the rescue was just the beginning. The human fleet had not traveled across the galaxy just to save 800 people. They had come to make a statement to the entire galaxy about the consequences of attacking human settlements. The orbital destroyers carried more than just weapons, they carried engineers, construction equipment, and everything needed to rebuild the colony stronger than before. This was not just about saving lives, it was about proving that humanity would never surrender a world, once claimed young technician Nam. Jiwoo finally abandoned his radio station and emerged into the sunlight. For the first time in months, the human ships in orbit had restored all communication, links with Earth and other human worlds. The isolation that had been the colonists' greatest torment was over. The rescue fleet had brought news from home, messages from families and friends who had been praying for the colonists' safety. The galaxy had watched the battle for New Bizin, and humanity had announced its presence in a way that could not be ignored. Dr. Yuhana worked alongside the rescue medical teams and marveled at their equipment. The technology they brought was decades ahead of anything the colony had possessed. Advanced medical scanners that could detect injuries invisible to the naked eye, healing chambers that could accelerate recovery. The human soldiers established security perimeters around the colony, but their mission was not defensive, it was symbolic. The weapons that had destroyed the Vorth fleet remained in orbit as a reminder to any species that might consider attacking human worlds in the future. The colonists began to understand that they had not just been rescued, they had been vindicated. Their suffering had not been in vain. It had awakened something in humanity that the galaxy had never seen before. The attack on New Bizin had united the human species in a way that nothing else could. Park Han-Woo stood in the ruins of his office and looked up at the human ships in orbit. They were not just warships, they were symbols of humanity's determination to protect its own. The colonists had been abandoned by the galaxy, but they had never been alone. The rescue operation continued for days as the human fleet worked to evacuate the wounded and bring in supplies for reconstruction. The colonists, who had lived in tunnels for months, were finally able to walk freely on the surface of their world. Kim So-jin took her children to see the human soldiers who had saved them. Minho was fascinated by their armor and weapons, while Taiho asked endless questions about Earth and other human worlds. The children, who had known only fear, were beginning to dream of the future again. The human fleet had come from across the galaxy, bringing not just soldiers, but teachers, doctors, engineers, and everyone needed to rebuild a shattered world. The rescue of New Bizin had become the largest humanitarian operation in human history. As the sun set over the colony for the first time in months, the sky was clear of enemy ships. The stars that had been hidden behind Vorth vessels were visible again, and they seemed to shine brighter than before. The nightmare was over and the healing could begin, but the galaxy had learned a lesson that would echo through the ages. Humanity had revealed its true nature, not as weak colonists, but as a species that would travel any distance, pay any price, and face any enemy to protect its own. The survivors of New Bizin had given up hope, but hope had never given up on them. Admiral Vextar stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the sensor readings with growing alarm. Something was coming toward his fleet from deep space, and it was big. The Vorth had conquered 47 worlds in the past decade, but they had never seen energy signatures like these. The reptilian commander had 300 ships under his command. The pride of the Vorth Empire hung in orbit around the human colony like a net of death. Each vessel was a masterpiece of destruction, capable of turning entire cities into glass, but now those same ships were registering readings that made no sense. His weapons officer, a young Vorth named Kexalon, reported that the approaching objects were massive. Each one was the size of a small moon, and they were moving faster than anything in the Vorth databases. The energy output from their engines was enough to power an entire star system. Admiral Vextar had studied human military capabilities for months before the invasion. The reports said they were weak, scattered across too many worlds to mount effective resistance. Their ships were small and their weapons were primitive. The conquest of New Bizin was supposed to be easy, but these approaching vessels were nothing like the human ships in the intelligence reports. These were weapons of war built by a species that understood destruction on a cosmic scale. The admiral felt something he had not experienced in decades. Fear. Captain Yoon Jae-sung stood in the command center of the orbital destroyer Soul's Hammer and prepared to deliver justice. The massive ship was one of 12 that had traveled from Earth, carrying the combined fury of humanity. Each vessel was 3 kilometers long and packed with enough firepower To crack a planet behind him, dozens of officers worked at their stations, coordinating the most devastating attack in human history. These were not regular Navy personnel, these were volunteers who had dropped everything when word reached Earth about the colony's fate. Scientists had left their laboratories. Engineers had abandoned their projects, retired. Soldiers had come out of retirement. The human fleet had been built in secret over the past 50 years. Earth's leaders had always known that expansion into space would eventually bring contact with hostile aliens. The orbital destroyers were humanity's insurance policy. Weapons so powerful that no enemy would dare threaten human worlds. Lieutenant Commander Han Sumin ran the weapons systems on Sol's hammer. She had trained for this moment her entire life, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality. The ship's main cannon could punch through the core of a planet. Its secondary batteries could vaporize asteroids. The point defense systems could track and destroy thousands of targets. Simultaneously, the crew of Sol's hammer had volunteered for a one-way mission. They knew they might not survive the battle, but they also knew that 800 humans were counting on them. Every person on the ship carried photos of the new Bizan colonists, people they had never met, but who were family nonetheless. The battle began without warning. The human fleet opened fire simultaneously. Their weapons painted space with streams of pure energy that moved at the speed of light. The Vorth shields, which had seemed so impressive moments before, crumbled like tissue paper. The first salvo destroyed 60 enemy ships in 3 seconds. Admiral Vextar watched in horror as his fleet died around him. These were not the weak humans from the intelligence reports. These were apex predators who had been hiding their true nature. His flagship shook under the impact of human weapons, and alarms screamed throughout the bridge. The Vorth had made a critical error. They had assumed that because human frontier colonies were lightly defended, the species as a whole was weak. But what they had not understood was that every human colony was connected to Earth by bonds stronger than gravity. Attack one, and you declared war on all of them. The orbital destroyers moved through the enemy fleet like sharks through schools of fish. Their weapons never stopped firing, and their shields absorbed everything the Vorth could throw at them. Human technology had advanced far beyond what the galaxy suspected. They had kept their most powerful weapons secret, waiting for the day they would be needed on the surface of New Bizan. The colonists watched in amazement as their tormentors fell from the sky like burning stars. The Vorth ships that had terrorized them for months were being destroyed so quickly that the explosions looked like fireworks. The night sky was filled with the light of dying enemies. Park Hyun-woo pressed his face against the window of the command bunker and wept tears of joy. He had given up hope, but hope had never given up on him. The lights he had seen forming patterns in the sky were human ships coming to save them. Earth had not forgotten its children. In the tunnels below, Kim So-jin held her children and pointed toward the ceiling. The sound of explosions was different now. Instead of the sharp crack of Vorth weapons hitting human buildings, it was the rumble of enemy ships being torn apart. Her daughter Minna clapped her hands and laughed for the first time in months. The Vorth ground forces had been preparing for a final assault on the colony bunkers. Their commanders had promised them easy victory over the weak humans, but now their orbital support was gone and strange lights were falling from the sky. The reptilian soldiers looked up in confusion as their world changed around them. Captain Choi Min-ho gathered his remaining defenders and watched the enemy positions through his binoculars. The Vorth troops were in chaos. Their communications were down and their heavy weapons were silent. Without their ships in orbit, they were just soldiers on an alien world facing an enemy that had just demonstrated the power to destroy fleets. The human orbital platforms had achieved complete space superiority in less than 10 minutes. 300 Vorth ships had been reduced to expanding clouds of debris. The few surviving enemy vessels were fleeing toward deep space, but the human ships were following them. Their mission was not just rescue, but complete annihilation. Young technician Nam Ji-woo sat at his communication station and heard something he had not heard in months. A clear signal from space, human voices speaking in Korean and English and Chinese telling the colonists that rescue had arrived. The static was gone, replaced by the sound of home. The Vorth had thought they were fighting farmers and miners, but they had awakened something far more dangerous. They had attacked The children of a species that had clawed its way to the top of the food chain on a world where everything tried to kill everything else. Humanity had spent millions of years learning how to destroy its enemies. Admiral Vextar's flagship exploded. In a ball of white-hot plasma, the proud commander of the Vorth fleet died without understanding what had happened to his empire. His last thought was that the intelligence reports had been wrong. The humans were not weak prey, they were the ultimate predators. The orbital bombardment that followed was surgical in its precision. Human weapons reached down from space and touched every Vorth position on the planet. Enemy bunkers became craters. Tank formations vanished in flashes of light supply. Depots exploded in mushroom clouds that could be seen from orbit, but the human weapons never touched the colony. The orbital platforms had targeting systems so advanced they could hit individual soldiers without harming the buildings next to them. The colonists watched in awe as their enemies were destroyed all around them while they remained perfectly safe. The message was clear to every species in the galaxy. Humanity had revealed its true nature. The weak colonists had been a mask hiding the face of a species that could build weapons capable of destroying entire fleets. The galaxy would never look at humans the same way again. As dawn broke over New Bizan, the sky was clear of enemy ships. For the first time in 3 months, the colonists could see the stars without the shadow of Vorth vessels blocking them out. The nightmare was over, but the galaxy had learned a lesson that would echo through the ages. Touch humanity's children and face the wrath of Earth. 1 year after the rescue, New Bizan was no longer just a colony, it had become a symbol. The mining settlement that had nearly been destroyed by the Vorth Empire was now thriving again, but it was different than before. The buildings were stronger, the defenses were better, and the people walked with their heads held high. Kim Sojin stood in the memorial garden reading the names carved into black stone. These were the colonists who had died during the occupation, the children who had been killed in the bombing, the adults who had sacrificed themselves to protect others. Their names would never be forgotten. Her children, Minna and Teho, played nearby, their laughter echoing across the garden, the sound that had once seemed impossible during the darkest days of the war was now a daily reminder of what the human fleet had fought to preserve. They were growing up in a galaxy where humanity was respected. The memorial garden was beautiful, but it was also a warning. The names of the dead were carved in stone that had been taken from the ruins of Vorth warships. The message was clear to anyone who might threaten human colonies in the future. This is what happens to those who harm our people. Park Hae-in-woo walked through the rebuilt streets of New Bizan every morning and marveled at the transformation. The colony was more prosperous than it had ever been. The rescue had brought attention from across human space, and investment had poured in from dozens of worlds. The mining operations were producing more rare metals than anyone had thought possible, but that was not what made the colony special. New Bizan had become a pilgrimage site for humans from across the galaxy. They came to see the place where their species had announced its true nature to the stars. The orbital platform still hung in space above the colony, their weapons pointed toward the stars like metal fingers of warning. Admiral Yoon Jae-sung had established his headquarters in orbit above New Bizan, and the colony had become the center of human military power in the sector. The presence of the fleet was not just defensive, it was symbolic. The massive ship served as a reminder to every species in the galaxy that humanity would never again allow one of its colonies to face extinction alone. The bonds between human worlds had been forged in fire and could not be broken. Captain Choi Min-ho had been promoted to colonel and now commanded the permanent garrison stationed on New Bizan. His soldiers were no longer farmers and shopkeepers with weapons. They were professional troops trained to the highest standards. The colony would never again be defenseless. The transformation of New Bizan had been remarkable, but it was nothing compared to the changes in the galaxy itself. The Vorth Empire had collapsed completely, their territory carved up by other species who had learned not to underestimate the power of human retaliation. Trade agreements and mutual defense pacts had followed the military victory as other species sought to align themselves with the newly revealed power. The galaxy had learned that humans were not just another species of colonists, they were apex predators who had been hiding their true nature. Dr. Lim Hae-jin had stayed on New Bizan to help the colonists recover from their trauma. Her clinic had become a model for treating the psychological wounds of war. The techniques she developed were now used throughout human space to help other survivors of alien attacks. The children who had cowered in bunkers during the occupation were now attending schools that taught them about their place in the galaxy. They learned that they were not just colonists, they were citizens of the most powerful military force in known space. Young technician Nam Ji-woo had become the colony's communications director. His equipment could now reach any human world in minutes, and his signals were carried by satellites that were protected by the orbital platforms. No human colony would ever again face the isolation that had nearly destroyed New Busan. The galaxy had changed in ways that went far beyond military power. The story of New Busan had spread throughout known space, becoming legend. It was told in schools, commemorated in monuments, and remembered in the hearts of every human who understood that they were part of something greater than themselves. The rescue had demonstrated that humanity possessed not just advanced technology, but the will to use it in defense of their people. The orbital destroyers had proven that human engineering could build weapons capable of destroying entire fleets in minutes. But more importantly, the campaign had shown that humans would never abandon their own, no matter how far they traveled or how dangerous their situation became. The bonds between human settlements transcended space and time, connecting every colonist to the vast resources of their homeworld. The Vorth had made the fatal error of assuming that, because human frontier colonies were lightly defended, the species as a whole was weak. They had discovered too late that every human settlement was protected by the combined might of their entire civilization. Other species had taken note of the lesson. The weak prey they had ignored for decades had revealed themselves as the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. Trade routes that had once avoided human space now sought it out. Alliance offers flooded Earth's diplomatic channels. The transformation had been so complete that some species had trouble believing it was real. The same humans who had once been seen as harmless colonists were now feared and respected throughout the galaxy. The mask had been torn away, and the true face of humanity revealed. Park Hyun-woo often walked to the highest point in the colony at sunset and looked up at the orbital platforms hanging in space like guardian angels. The massive ships had become part of the landscape, as familiar as the mountains on the horizon. The colony administrator remembered the dark days when the Vorth had seemed invincible, when escape had been impossible and death had seemed certain. But hope had never truly died. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to return. The children of New Busan would grow up knowing that they were protected by the full might of human civilization. They would never know the fear that had gripped their parents during the occupation, because the galaxy had learned to respect the power of their species. The memorial garden was not just a place of mourning, it was a place of promise. The names carved in stone were a reminder that human lives had value and that humanity would pay any price to protect its own. The story of New Busan had become part of human culture, spreading from world to world and inspiring new generations of colonists. They knew that no matter how far they traveled or how dangerous their destination, they would never truly be alone. The orbital platforms continued their eternal patrol, their crews ready to repeat the lesson if necessary. The galaxy had been warned, and the warning had been written in fire across the stars. Humanity had announced its presence to the galaxy, and that announcement would echo through the ages. The survivors of New Busan had given up hope, but hope had never given up on them. The weak colonists had revealed themselves as the children of the most dangerous species in known space. The galaxy would never forget the lesson, and humanity would never again be underestimated. The new dawn had risen over New Busan, and it illuminated a galaxy where humans walked as equals among the stars, where their colonies were respected and their people were protected. The nightmare was over, but the legend was just beginning. The morning sun on Kepler 442b looked different today. It was still red and angry like always, but now it seemed to mock the people. Below, Park Hyun-woo stood at the window of his office, watching the smoke rise from the burning warehouses. The Vorth had hit them again last night, destroying another week of food supplies. 3 months ago, this place had been paradise. New Busan was supposed to be humanity's shining example of how to build a new world. The mining operations were pulling rare metals from the ground faster than anyone had dreamed possible. Families were happy. Children played in the streets that smelled like fresh concrete and hoped then the Vorth came park. Han Wu remembered that day like it was burned into his brain. The sky had turned black with their ships, hundreds of them, each one bigger than the largest building in the colony. Their weapons had spoken, first turning the spaceport into a crater of twisted metal and broken dreams. Now he was trapped here with 800 people who looked to him for answers. He did not have the last transport ship had tried to escape 2 days ago. Park Han Wu had watched it climb toward the stars, carrying 50 children and their parents. He had felt hope for exactly 30 seconds before the Vorth fighter caught it. The explosion had lit up the sky like a second sun. In the tunnels below the colony, Kim So-jin held her children close. The underground bunkers had been built for mining accidents, not for war. They were cramped and dark and filled with the smell of fear. Her daughter Minna was only 6 years old, but she had learned not to cry when the bombing started. Her son Taeho was 8 and tried to act brave, but she could see the terror in his eyes. Her husband Lee Dong-min had volunteered for the Defense Force 3 days ago. He had kissed her goodbye and promised to come back, but she had not heard from him since. The radio in the bunker crackled with static and sometimes screams, but never his voice. She told herself he was still alive because the alternative was too terrible to think about. The Vorth were not like other enemies. They did not just want to win. They wanted to break the humans first, to make them suffer before they died. Kim So-jin had heard stories from the other colonies. The reptilian creatures would capture humans and torture them in public squares. They would destroy everything beautiful and leave only pain and darkness above ground. Captain Choi Min-ho gathered his remaining soldiers in what used to be the community center. The walls were cracked from the bombing and half the roof was missing, but it was still the safest place they had. His army was a joke, 20 men and women who had been farmers and shopkeepers before the war. They held their weapons like they were holding snakes. Most of them had never fired a shot in anger before the Vorth came. Now they were expected to fight professional soldiers who had conquered dozens of worlds. Captain Choi Min-ho looked at their faces and saw the same thing in all of them. They were going to die, but they were going to die fighting. The communication room was the saddest place in the colony. Banks of expensive equipment that had once connected them to Earth and the other human worlds now sat silent. The Vorth had jammed every frequency and destroyed every satellite. The colonists might as well have been on the other side of the universe. Young technician Nam Ji-woo sat at his station every day trying to break through the jamming. He was 19 years old and had come to New Bison to start a new life. Now he spent his days listening to static and hoping for a miracle that never came. His fingers moved across the controls like he was playing a piano, but the only music was the sound of interference. Vorth had a system for breaking colonies. They would surround a world and cut off all escape routes. Then they would bomb strategic targets to show their power, but leave the people alive to suffer. Next, they would demand surrender, and when it did not come, they would start killing civilians. One by one, New Bison was in the second phase. The bombing had been going on for weeks now. The Vorth ships would appear in the sky like black angels of death. Their weapons would reach down and touch something important. A power plant, a water treatment facility, a school. The message was clear. Surrender or watch everything you love turn to ash. But the colonists did not surrender. They could not surrender because they knew what happened to humans who gave up. The Vorth did not take prisoners. They took slaves and experiments and toys to break when they got bored. Dr. Yu Hannah worked in the medical center that had been set up in the deepest part of the tunnel system. She had been a pediatrician before the war, treating scraped knees and childhood illnesses. Now she operated on blast victims with tools meant for mining equipment. Her hands shook every time she had to tell a parent that their child would not be coming home. The worst part was the children who came in alone, their parents dead in the bombing, their eyes empty and staring like they had seen too much. The doctor would patch their wounds and hold them while they cried, but she knew that some hurts could never be healed. Food was running low. The colony had been designed to import most of its supplies from other worlds, but those supply lines were cut. The hydroponic gardens could not feed 800 people, and the bombing had destroyed half of them anyway. People were already getting thinner and hungrier. Water was a problem too. The Vorth had hit the main treatment plant on the second day, and the Backup systems were failing. The colonists had to boil water from the mining pits and hope it would not make them sick. Everything tasted like metal and fear. At night, the colonists would gather in the main tunnel and try to pretend things were normal. Someone would play guitar, and they would sing songs from Earth. They would tell stories about their families back home and make plans for after the war. But everyone knew there would be no after. Everyone knew they were going to die here. The children were the hardest to watch. They still played games, but their games were about hiding from monsters and running from explosions. They drew pictures of their homes, but the houses were always burning and the sky was always full of enemy ships. Park Hyun-woo made his rounds every evening, checking on the different groups of survivors. He would smile and tell them that help was coming, but the words tasted like lies in his mouth. It had been 3 months since the attack began, and no rescue ships had appeared. The galaxy had forgotten about New Bis, and some people talked about fighting back, about building weapons and attacking the Vorth positions, but what could 800 civilians do against professional soldiers? The colonists had mining equipment and hunting rifles. The Vorth had weapons that could melt metal and armor that could stop bullets. The night sky used to be beautiful on Kepler 442b. The stars were different from Earth, but they still told stories of hope and wonder. Now the sky was full of enemy ships that hung like black clouds, waiting to rain death on anyone who showed resistance. But tonight something was different. As Park Hyun-woo stood at his window watching the enemy ships, he saw new lights in the sky. These were not the harsh red glows of Vorth weapons. These lights were blue and white, and they moved with purpose, forming patterns that looked almost familiar. He called to the others, and they crowded around the windows, straining to see what was happening above them. The lights were getting brighter, moving faster, coming closer, and for the first time in 3 months, Park Hyun-woo felt something he had almost forgotten: hope.